Around the world there are some epic cities. Like here in New York with massive skyscrapers and statues. And then some are more quaint, like my hometown in Dublin City. But regardless, all these cities are full with images and symbols. Some can be really complex, like random road signs that you just can't get your head around. But then others can be really simple, like your favorite advert or an iconic logo. Each one is trying to communicate something to us. There are some symbols we hate to see, like when we look down at our phones and see the dreaded 1% battery. No! But other symbols bring happiness, like that moment when you're out and about and suddenly get the urge to relieve yourself. You look around for a symbol of hope, and then when you see it, you do that awkward run towards freedom. Whether you live in a big city or even a town, amongst all other images and symbols, you'll find a symbol of a cross. It might be on a church, high-rise building, or just around people's necks. This Christian symbol carries with it a meaning. It speaks of a story that's still being told. Jesus died, and although it seems odd to a few, this matters to millions of people today. And while the symbol speaks of Jesus' death, the story doesn't end there. 3 days after Jesus died, stories began circulating that the tomb he was put in was found empty. So what happened? Where did the body go?
There's many possibilities to explain what happened the weekend of Jesus' death. Let's look at 4 of them. 1. Jesus survived crucifixion and fooled people into thinking he was resurrected. 2. The Roman or religious authorities took the body away. 3. The disciples stole it and then hid it. And 4. Jesus was actually resurrected from the dead.
So let's start with the crucifixion. Could Jesus have survived it? While we understand Jesus' significance today, he wasn't special in the eyes of the Roman Empire. They were taking over the known world, and Jesus was just another rebel, another revolutionary who had to be dealt with. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last.
The Romans had developed the most horrific and painful form of torture to deal with crime and rebellion. Once arrested, the guilty would be stripped, humiliated, beaten and flogged, a punishment so brutal and severe that many prisoners didn't even survive it.
You see, it wasn't just enough to simply end their lives. They had to do so in a way that would put fear into the hearts of those around them, especially those that followed them. Their enemies had to die painfully and slowly. Practice makes perfect, and by the time they got their hands on Jesus, they had created what they would consider to be their masterpiece, crucifixion.
Those who had the misfortune of surviving the flogging had to carry their cross, that they would be nailed to through their wrists and ankles. This was usually done in a public place, like a crossroads, where they would hang as a symbol that told the common people that the accused was defeated, and that Rome always wins. The wounds themselves were not actually what killed the victims though. Death would come eventually through heart failure, as it struggled to pump blood from an impossible body position to limbs that were nailed to wood but had no way of holding the body up straight. In his Gospel, John describes Jesus' final moments and writes that Jesus breathed his last. To make sure he was dead, a Roman centurion stabbed him in the side, and when he did, blood and water poured out.
This might seem like an unimportant detail, but it's actually crucial. What John didn't know then is what we know now because of the likes of the Irish scientist Samuel Houghton. In the 19th century, his research proved that when the left side of a body is pierced by a blade after death, water, followed by the flow of blood, proved and confirmed that fluid had built up around the heart and that the heart had stopped. John didn't know the science, he just knew what he saw, and what he saw was that Jesus was dead.
The idea that Jesus never died on the cross asks us to believe that a man could survive Roman flogging, a crucifixion from the world's most professional execution force, a spear through his heart, push away a huge stone, fight his way past a small army of guards, and then appear to his disciples as the picture of health. This explanation also requires Jesus to be the greatest con man of all, creating the greatest lie, Christianity.
What do you reckon it was like the days after Jesus had died? From what we do know, it was Passover, a Jewish religious festival. The streets would have been packed with Jewish men, women, and children. The Roman government and the Jewish authorities, they're happy because they've gotten rid of Jesus. While Jerusalem celebrates, however, there's this small group of heartbroken Jesus followers who have lost their leader, their mentor, and their friend. Though many refer to the 12 disciples, his following was much broader and included many women who played a large role in his ministry. The women who followed Jesus, they reacted by going out to Jesus' tomb, which many believed to be this very one, and they went there on the Sunday morning. When they get there, however, they find something that they did not expect. The large stone that had once covered the tomb had been rolled away, and the tomb was empty. The women at the tomb claimed that they met an angel who told them that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' followers, even claims to have met Jesus on that very day. When the disciples heard, they ran to the tomb, and they also found it empty. Now, we can't verify their claims or their experiences, but we can wrestle with the empty tomb. What possible reasons could there be for it to be empty?
The Romans had heard Jesus' predictions that he would rise from the dead after 3 days, and though they didn't take them too seriously, they did put some things in place. To prevent this, they covered the grave with a massive stone, sealed it, and had it guarded by Roman soldiers. So if someone could overcome the guards and move the stone, who would want to? What about the Romans themselves? Maybe it was an inside job. They were the ones that posted the extra guards, so they were technically in control of the body and they could have done anything with it. But what would have been their main goal in tampering with Jesus' body? They had already proved their power in killing Jesus and they just wanted him to stay dead and buried. Maybe the Jewish authorities took it. Possible, but again it would be hard to understand why. They were more than happy to have the tomb heavily guarded by the Romans. Also, their plan was to prove that Jesus was just a man and not the Son of God. Jesus remaining cold and dead was the only way that their involvement in Jesus' crucifixion could be justified.
And here's the crux of it for me. If either of these two powerful groups had taken the body of Jesus for some unknown reason, they would have been quick to produce it as soon as Jesus' followers had started claiming that he had risen from the dead. And Christianity would never have gotten off the ground. Or maybe it's worth asking, is the resurrection story just made up? Maybe it was an afterthought by the disciples. Like, what if we could get the gospel writer Matthew and interrogate him like this? How does facts hold up? How does story hold true? Of course we can never know, but if Matthew is trying to mislead a group of people and pass off fiction as history, I suggest he makes two huge mistakes. Firstly, he says that Pontius Pilate, a well-known figure at the time, gave permission for Jesus to be buried and instructed guards to watch over it. If the resurrection narrative was just fiction, it would have been incredibly easy for anyone to speak out against it, yet no one ever argued with the details found in Matthew's Gospel. He even goes on to say that this event happened in the tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph, or any of his surviving family, could have easily have nipped this story in the bud if it was simply made up. Secondly, and sadly, the first century was a very different world. Equal rights weren't even on the horizon. A woman's eyewitness testimony wasn't even considered valid unless it was backed up by a man. Yet it's recorded that women were the first to meet the resurrected Jesus. If you're making up a story, you don't choose legally unreliable witnesses as your primary source unless that's the way it actually happened. From the historical evidence that we've looked at so far, I think we can agree on three things. One, Jesus definitely died at his crucifixion. He was buried in a rich man's tomb in Jerusalem, and that tomb, which was heavily guarded by Romans, was found empty. So what happened? Well, I think, and what I'd like to suggest, is that we can definitely rule out the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities as suspects. So it leaves us with one legitimate possibility: the disciples. I think we should look at the disciples under two headings. First one would be opportunity, and the second one, motive. So, opportunity. As we read through the Gospels, the insight you get into the disciples and their character doesn't necessarily lead you to believe that they could become criminal masterminds overnight. Stealing the body of Jesus would have been a serious heist. And not only that, these guys are fishermen, they're peasants, they're accountants, and they're following a peace preaching, commandment keeping, i.e. do not steal, kind of teacher. Even if they had the skill set to pull that off, the evidence suggests that they didn't have the courage to do so. After Jesus' death, his disciples are depicted as a scared and disheartened group of followers in hiding. Jesus is arrested because one of them betrayed him, and when the arrest happens, the disciples scatter. And Jesus is actually left alone, forsaken by the group who said that they would die before ever forsaking him. When you read the stories of these individuals, it's mad to suggest that a group that were too afraid to launch a rescue mission for Jesus when he was alive would risk their lives to get his dead body back. What about motive? Initially, I can understand the case for the disciples stealing the body of Jesus and then claiming that he had been raised from the dead. Let's face it, no one likes to be wrong, and history is full of examples of people lying to get ahead. Where this breaks down, however, is over the long term. If the resurrection meant that the disciples went on to become powerful and influential, we would always wonder if they were telling the truth. They simply had nothing to gain by fabricating a new religious movement based on a lie. Because more than likely, they would have faced a lot of ridicule, a lot of torture, and ultimately a cruel death. But for what? Christians were killed or jailed long after the days of the apostles and all the way up until the time of the Emperor Constantine, almost 200 years later. From what we can tell from Christian tradition, several of the apostles were killed for their faith in horrible circumstances that they faced with extraordinary courage. To give your life for something is a powerful thing. You might be willing to die for a friend or a family member. You might be willing to die for a cause that you really believe in. But would you really be willing to die for a lie? When the Christian movement kicked off in Jerusalem, the Jewish authorities did everything they could to try and stop it. But what they found was that the harder they pushed, the more the church grew. An older, wiser rabbi reminded his colleagues of all the movements they had seen come and go in their lives and finished by saying, if this movement is of human design and creation, we don't need to oppose it. It will collapse by itself. But if it is from God, then no matter how hard we fight it, nothing will stop it. People have tried to fight it. Leaders, both old and new, have tried to wipe Christianity off the face of the earth. And here we are, 2,000 years later, talking about it. Perhaps this is the greatest evidence of the resurrection that we have.
The resurrection is a game changer. St. Paul said it best that if Christ did not rise from the dead, then Christianity is useless and we're to be pitied above all people. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, then I believe it changes everything.